Good evening, I'm Peter Shergold. I'm the head of the Centre for Social Impact, and welcome to Yakety Yak, which tonight is hosted by the Macquarie Group Foundation. This evening's guest is Ian Darling. He is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, but also a major Australian philanthropist. To interview him, as always, is Peter Thompson.
Ian, welcome to Yakety Yak.
Thank you, Peter.
Journalists need to put labels on people. And the label that, I'm not sure how well it sits on your shoulders, of documentary filmmaker, will that do?
Well, funny you say that. I think I described myself as a documentary filmmaker for the first time only a few weeks ago. I've been making documentaries for about 11 years now. But I think it was only when I was in the depths of a struggle, having worked day and night on the current film I'm on, where someone said, "What do you do?" And I actually said, "Well, I'm a documentary filmmaker." I guess I'd never really thought of myself as anything in particular, but given I'm spending 150% of my time on this film and a variety of other things, I felt it was a fair tag.
Can you remember the first time you felt like you wanted to make a difference in the world?
That's a really good question. I think I can remember the first time I started becoming aware of people who were making a difference. I think in terms of my journey, it's very much a work in progress, and I'm still not sure if I am making a difference or in the right space to be doing it. But I certainly know sort of certain occasions along the way where I've met people who were making a difference.
Well, you're a person of many parts, which we'll explore. But how might you count making a difference as? What would it be?
Oh, I think it's whether you're a good son, or whether you're kind to your friends in a school community, or in your local community. I guess it wasn't until I got involved in documentary that I felt I was potentially making a difference on a larger scale. And I think that's one of the great things about film, is you've got great leverage. You can tell the story once, it can go out to hundreds and thousands and hopefully millions of people. So I guess that was where I felt I was potentially involved in a space that could make a difference. But other than that, I guess from my parents, they were always sort of telling us to look after other people and be kind, and I know there were a few people at school that I may have been nice to, where I felt I made a difference to their lives.
Talking of your parents, there's a certain Darling family history which is worth exploring for a minute or so. Your great-grandfather came to South Australia?
Yeah, I guess I should say we have nothing to do with the Darlings that everyone knows something about. So Darling Harbour has no relationship to us. That was all Governor Ralph Darling. Now, our family came out to Adelaide in the 1850s, and my great-great-grandfather arrived on a boat, the bark Achilles, and was carried off the boat and had a couple of shillings to his name, and started carrying wheat sacks on the port of Adelaide, and I guess he had a couple of things going for him. One is a real tenacity. He worked very, very hard, but he had a lot of luck in the early days. And there was an interesting story that we've been told, where whilst he was penniless, he saw that a ship went down in the port of Adelaide, and he knew that it was carrying flour, and the cargo had been totally written off, and he was smart enough to realise that with the salt water there was probably a hard shell around the flour. So he found a way to raise the boat, took the big pile of flour that he discovered under this hard shell, and then sold off the flour, and then he was away. And probably 20 or 30 years later, he was known as the Grain King. So it was a great instance of having smarts and working hard.
So this business success, the Grain King, which was sort of intergenerational, wasn't it? It was he and his son that actually sort of became known under this label.
Yeah.
What do they do besides going for sunken treasure?
Well, they became flour millers and grain traders, and set up a major trade route between Australia and the United Kingdom in grain. And the family was in that up until about the 1950s, I think, or 60s. I know on my birth certificate, when I look at the occupation of my father, it says flour miller.
Oh.
So I guess in 1962, that's what he was.
And a couple of generations of this family went into the South Australian Parliament at various times, and were also involved quite a bit in the Baptist Church.
That's something I haven't really followed all that strongly. I know that they had connections with the Salvation Army, but I'm not actually that aware of the Baptist Church.
But whatever church it was sort of quite an engagement in sort of the philanthropic aspects of their mission.
Yeah, well, I think Adelaide, despite being known as the city of churches, seemed to have a philanthropic bent in those days.
And one of these, not directly your forebear, but an uncle, great uncle, was captain of the Australian cricket team.
Well, at the turn of the century, I think there were 9 sons, and they all went in different directions. But yeah, Joe Darling was captain of Australia cricket in the early 1900s.
Now, with all of this, is this a burden of family history weighing on your shoulders?
I don't think so. I guess
story.
Well, I guess we've all gone our own ways. Sort of, there's been a strong connection to business, but burden's a big word, and I guess I've never sort of felt the weight of it on my shoulders. Maybe it's interesting because if there's a family motto, my grandfather and great-grandfather always said, "Keep your mouth shut and your pen dry." And I think it's quite an interesting one. I don't know why I'm sitting here, but I think as a family we're not that well known, and I think sometimes if you're a very public family, then perhaps the burden's greater. That I don't feel as though I've had any great expectations, so to speak, placed on me.
When you were at school, you were passionate about drama, and in a way, I think that's what you thought your path would be.
Well, it's funny. I remember thinking that I actually wanted to be an actor and make films when I was about 5 or 6. And
it's an early start.
It is. I sort of realised that I had a great gift for remembering lines. And even in the early nativity plays, I could remember everyone else's lines in the play. And I don't know where that came from. My grandmother used to take us to musicals, and we loved theatre in the early days. I remember when Sid Charisse came out and we saw her in No No Nanette and a whole series of other actors. And my parents were good friends of John McCallum and Googie Withers. Right. And we went to see their plays whenever they came to Melbourne, and the Melbourne audiences loved them, and they came on stage and everyone would clap. But then we had the great privilege of going backstage, and I saw this unbelievable world unfolding, that all these sets were make-believe, and these people had been there telling this sort of incredibly believable story, and then going backstage and seeing these actors waving their arms around and drinking bubbly drink and thinking that and I thought, wow, how long's this been going on? People are loving what they're doing, and they'd entertained us, and we're having so much fun. And I remember those days, and I guess anyone who's involved in film always sort of said, I was taken to the local cinema, and I loved seeing the Saturday afternoon matinees, but I loved doing that as well. And so I guess I had a strong sense of film and theatre. And at that stage, I just wanted to involve myself in every single production at school that I possibly could.
Well, you took it seriously enough to apply for NIDA.
I did. That was an interesting one. I think when I was at university, I still dreamt of being an actor. I thought I was a good footballer at school, but once I got to university, I realised that perhaps I wasn't. And I think maybe as an actor, I was so passionate about it. But it was interesting because I walked in the door for my NIDA audition and walked straight out. And I think I was too afraid to fail. And if you're going to be a great actor, if you're going to succeed in anything, you've got to be prepared to fail. I think you need great talent and an enormous amount of energy to be an actor, but I certainly didn't have the talent. But if I didn't have that willingness to fail, I think that was perhaps a very early indication.
So you took a different path. You studied accounting at ANU. Strange place to study accounting, but presumably
that's what I felt at the time too. So yeah, I guess I was at school. I took more of it whilst doing a lot of drama. Took a more traditional sort of business approach, and so I did accounting at ANU, and then went into stockbroking. I worked with an American investment bank, Prudential Bache, in Melbourne and New York, and then followed that up with at the same time as I was applying for NIDA the second time, same result, walked out. I applied to business school and then went to business school in Switzerland. It was called IMD there, which was a very intensive 1 year.
You have to actually put this in its time and place. When you were with Prudential Bache, that was at the time that Bond and Elliott were doing well.
It was. I guess I was a research analyst during the boom time in the 80s. So being in New York when the first boom happened, and then coming back and discovering a lot of these companies in Australia that were exploding, it was quite an exciting time to be learning things and to actually have discovered a market crash within the first few years of my working life. I think that was a very, very valuable lesson, because you come out of university and you see the stock market going in one direction. You sort of get caught up in the hype. So I think that was very timely to be sort of young enough to have been impacted by the '87 crash.
Well, you didn't stay, and then you went to IMD to do an MBA, which you say obviously had a big impact on you.
Well, I think the thing about an intensive business school is the people you meet. And I was one of the youngest in the class. We had 60 people there from 29 different nationalities. And I saw that they'd all done some really interesting things, and that they accepted people because of sort of the blend of what they'd done. And I've always learnt so much from those around me, whether it's been grandparents or sort of contemporaries. And I was really stimulated by the group I was with.
What did that change your path?
Not at that stage. I came back. I guess I was going to work with a management consulting firm in the UK. But a friend of mine, Mark Nelson, and I had spoken about setting up an investment management business, and the time seemed right to do that in the early 90s. And we were both great fans of Warren Buffett, and we thought if we could apply the same sorts of business principles that he had to an investment management business in Australia, that maybe we'd have half a chance.
Yeah. And those principles were?
Ones that I found that were simple enough for me to understand was to invest in good businesses where you could predict their earnings, that were run by people that you admired and trusted, and that they were businesses that you wanted to hold for a very long time. And there was sort of another overlay, and I think one of the things that really impressed us with Warren Buffett is that he not only had the best investment record around, but he was very aware of his local community. He did great things in the community, and also really looked after his not only his shareholders but his employees. And I think it was a great realisation that business isn't an either or. You don't have to simply have the best profits and ignore everything else along the way. And if Warren Buffett could do it, we thought, well, maybe we've got half a chance.
So here we are, about 1992, and you and Mark set up Caledonia Investments, and what you take funds from the private sector and basically invest them.
Well, initially it was just a group of sort of friends and family members, and then after about 5 years we opened it out to I guess other like-minded investors that knew what we were doing. But it was again totally off the radar, and I guess that's the way we liked it. But we just wanted to keep it very focused, invest in about 15 businesses at any given time, and try and hold them for a very long period as well.
This starts the morphing process to actually get an interest in philanthropy. And it sort of happened organically, you say.
Yeah, I think probably being in the business sector, eventually you get sniffed out to join a board or a fundraising committee, and it was actually here at Macquarie where I was tapped on the shoulder by David Clark and Cameron O'Reilly to see if I'd like to join an investment or a fundraising committee for the Salvation Army. They were setting up an education foundation. And I guess a lot of the time it's who does the asking that influences you. I mean, I'd always sort of felt I knew what the Salvation Army did, but that was the first sort of entree there into joining a philanthropic board. And
then, around 2002, you set up your own foundation?
Yeah, we set up the Caledonia Foundation formally then, but I guess with the sort of involvement we had in a number of boards, that we were starting to think about what we were doing in a pretty unsophisticated way. I mean, I think one of the great things about the establishment of the PPFs, which the foundations, is it made it so much easier to give. And it also forced you to think about what it was you were wanting to give to. And we decided that it was nice to be general enough but sufficiently focused that we wanted to support young Australians, and with a strong emphasis on education and training and early intervention. And a lot of that came from the sorts of things we were seeing already, that around Australia there were a lot of organisations doing great things to help young people, but it also sort of highlighted the need. So that was the area we focused on.
So this is really like putting a toe in the water and seeing what happened, wasn't it?
I guess so, that we applied very much the same business principles to the foundation as we did to the investment group. That although we invested in only about 15 to 20 stocks, we visited hundreds and hundreds of companies. And that was the first thing we did. We visited as many different organisations as we could possibly find in those early days, and then tried to make an impact by giving to just a small number of organisations. And that sort of that was still being sort of tested over the years, but I think we found we were better at giving when we had a stronger focus on fewer organisations.
So what's it like saying no to people, because there was a flood of applicants for obviously worthy causes?
It's an interesting thing in the philanthropic space. I think there can be a trap of like, we're only a small organisation with limited resources. We found that initially we were spending about 90% of our time saying no. And because we were open to applications, and we thought, well, let's actually close the doors, and we've got a sense of what's out there. Let's spend 90% of our time working strategically with partners and trying to make a difference. Which I think it's horses for courses, but for us that worked very well. We found a variety of ways of saying no. That for a number of organisations that we felt weren't that sophisticated in what they were asking for, we'd send them along to SVA courses and things like that. But we found once we started spending more time strategically and less time saying no, that we were really starting to increase the impact of what we were doing.
And what was the shape of your own structure in terms of making this happen?
Well, it was pretty simple. We had a part-time executive officer and a board that made decisions very quickly. But I think it was by narrowing down the focus that we all were working in the same direction. And one of the things, again, we noticed was that before we closed the doors, that a huge number of organisations, or a huge number of applications, were coming in from organisations involved with homelessness and then youth homelessness. And that started to give us an impression that not only there wasn't a huge amount of collaboration in the sector, but the need was enormous, yet it seemed to be totally off the agenda. And that was when we started to sort of form partnerships with a couple of organisations in that space.
What about the organisations themselves, the not-for-profits? What were you finding about them and their structures and the limitations of actually how they worked?
I think across the board that there's an incredibly dedicated, hard-working group of people in that sector who can't do it for the money because it's still under-recognised. I think I'd love to see people being rewarded more fairly in that sector. I think though that there's still a tendency to perhaps not collaborate as much as perhaps they should, and that there seemed to be a lot of duplication of resources, and that a lot of organisations, even in the same neighbourhood, weren't sharing their assets, and they'd been raising money for bricks and mortar, and then some of them had sort of empty operations. That I felt a lot of organisations needed to cooperate a lot more. But I think the most striking thing was that so many of these organisations were chasing the tail for funding, and each year that the problems were getting worse, and especially in youth homelessness, that there were more and more people needing beds, and more people needing food, and more people needing just the basic sort of services, and hence I felt the need to somehow try and raise awareness of this. And this is, I guess, where the coupling of increasingly becoming a documentary filmmaker came in, that thought there was maybe a way of telling a story to raise the awareness of what was happening out there in an area that we thought had a huge issue.
And this is unique about you, that all these sorts of interests start to merge, which we'll sort of come to in a moment. But I just want to ask one more question about the organisations themselves. You were asking about your own organisation, were you getting sufficient return on your social capital? So what do you mean by that?
Well, I guess for every dollar you put out there, is it actually making a difference? That if you put $1 into an organisation and it's for simply food and shelter, and believe me, those are the most basic needs, so it needs to happen. But the next day, that money is all gone. If you're an organisation that's as small as ours, we were looking to sort of put $1 into something, and that dollar would turn into sort of X, that there was some sort of multiplier on it, and raising awareness about an issue is an interesting way of doing it. Partnering with organisations is another way. So trying to get a number of organisations in a more collaborative space whereby they can increase the efficiencies. I mean, there's so many ways of doing it, but I think it was the pure exercise of trying to think about whether or not we were making an impact that started to make us more focused in the sorts of things we were doing.
It'd be easy to say that came because of that philosophy, because of your investment training.
Maybe we needed to. Well, I guess the thing with investment is at the end of the day, you have a number, and you're compounding at 20% per annum, and I guess that's your those were the days.
That's the way it used to be.
Those are the days. But you have a figure. But I guess it was trying to get back into that sort of discipline. I think it can be sometimes you can spend too much time trying to measure the impact, and some of the greatest social investments we've made have been on things where it's simply put a smile on a kid's face. So you don't really get caught up too much in bringing it down to a number. But I think just the pure exercise of trying to work out whether or not you are making an impact is incredibly useful.
Now, let's go back to these merging of your interests. Another very significant thing, as well as going to IMD, was to take a road trip with Min and the 3 girls to the United States. You took a year off. What happened?
Well, it's an interesting phrase, taking a year off. When you're trying to educate 3 young girls, it's not really a year off. But it was an extraordinary experience, because I guess we left with no fixed agenda, and I think that's a wonderful thing of not knowing where you're actually going to be spending the night on any particular day, and we drove across the States and ended up driving across a lot of Europe, and basically lived a year out of the back of a car, whilst trying to give the kids a really exciting experience and broadening their horizons in a very different sort of way. One of the fascinating things I discovered sort of professionally, and the year wasn't all about me, I assure you, but I had a film that was on the road alone across Australia, and it was going to a number of film festivals. And it was at these festivals where I suddenly saw in the credits that so many of these documentaries had been funded by philanthropic foundations. And that was a real sort of aha moment, thinking, what is it about these films that would make a philanthropic foundation want to give to a film? And in Australia it seemed sort of unheard of, and there were so many exclusions by foundations to wanting to give to films. It just didn't seem to be a worthy philanthropic pursuit. One
of the examples of this filmmaking has been Ken Burns, who I think is very widely known throughout Australia because of his Civil War series and others. Just magnificent, monumental television filmmaking. And he was underwritten, wasn't he, to some extent by the General Motors Foundation? But by General Motors and by the MacArthur Foundation, and by a whole list of other wealthy individuals and foundations. You met Ken Burns?
I have. I had the great privilege of spending a number of days with Ken when he was out here initially, and we've spent quite a bit of time together since. And he was a great mentor in terms of showing why foundations would be interested in investing in his films. I mean, he has a huge education component with all of his films, and so for General Motors, if they're supporting him and he's making a film about the Civil War, there's no sort of product placement that's likely to happen in a film like that. But and there was a lot of suspicion around why corporations may want to be involved in this space, but I guess they believed, and the foundations, is that he was educating a whole generation of Americans about these specific events, and in many ways he's redefined the history of America through these tales and following the population shifts of America to give an indication of how the country's developed. So the Burns model was to create a slice of history, create educational outreach and have impact
that way in terms of social change. Also, you've added an involvement. Talk about Oasis for a moment, which is a fine example of what it is that you do. You've been involved in giving support to the Salvation Army's work with youth homelessness through Oasis. You've made a film about it, and it's also very much linked to educational output.
Yeah, I think it was my initial connection with the Salvation Army that gave me an indication of what they were doing in a whole variety of areas, but especially when I started spending time at the Oasis Youth Support Network with Paul and Robin Moulds. And I guess that was where I really saw that the need was so great. And as a documentary filmmaker, you do need access and you do need trust. And I think, luckily, they trusted me once I'd formally removed myself from the board positions. That they trusted me enough to enable us to go in there for a very long period of time to make this documentary, The Oasis, which was a 3-year project. And what we wanted with that was to tell a really confronting story that would actually take the face of youth homelessness into the lounge rooms of Australia, but also to couple that with a report that would not only provide hope but a series of solutions. So we commissioned the National Youth Commission into youth homelessness, which was an Australia-wide commission. Yeah. So with the Caledonia Foundation, that was funded, and then a major report was presented to government at the same time that we screened the film on the ABC.
Let's talk about this remarkable commission that you set up, which was about 2006, when youth homelessness was getting more and more heated as a public issue. The Labor Party under the Rudd government actually undertook work in that area with
Well, the commission started during the final days of the Howard government, and when it was released, there had been a change of government. So we thought we would have been presenting it to a government that had been in place for over 10 years.
So you appointed experts to take part in this as commissioners, and they went to various parts of Australia over a number of months and took evidence from 319 people that made actually representations to you. And there were 79 other submissions, as I remember, or thereabouts. So it became a mammoth task, and was really sort of the output of, in a sense, the initiative of the foundation, your foundation.
I guess that it was part of that. There was an interesting model 20 years earlier where Brian Burdekin produced his report into human rights, and it seemed
that was done under government, though. That
was done under government, but it had been 20 years since a major piece had been done, and I think there's great merit in doing a community commission. So we are getting the voice of people from all around Australia.
It's brazen.
Well, I think it was an important thing, and whether it encouraged the government to come out with their green paper and then white paper, I'm not sure. But there seemed to be a nice connection that they knew something was coming from the private sector, and it was important that they had a response. So after we released our report and presented it to them, 6 months later they released their report as well.
How do you stitch all these interests together?
I guess it's important to be a walking conflict of interest. That
aren't we all?
Yeah, I guess in the areas that I'm in, that I only in my documentary work, I only make stories about films that I'm interested in or about people that have influenced me, and I guess it's in that space where you do spend time, and everything sort of seems to fall into place that way. But I think when I came back from overseas and decided I wanted to make the shift into being sort of far more of a full-time filmmaker and spend a lot more time in the philanthropic space, the two seemed to connect very nicely. And it was at a time where there were so many powerful examples coming out of the US that it was easy for me to follow this model of actually being involved in all the spaces. I mean, one of the models that we used for the Oasis, which still is going 4 years later in terms of its outreach, was An Inconvenient Truth. And I think Davis Guggenheim's film probably did more for the movement in terms of climate change and global warming than any other documentary.
It's interesting you mentioned Guggenheim, not Gore, in that context. Guggenheim being the filmmaker.
Yeah, well, I guess that's exactly right. But I guess Al Gore has been the face of it, but it was interesting just seeing that the strategy of the filmmaker and how he enabled Al Gore to come up with the strategy of partnering with organisations around the world and having all these champions of the environmental movement to tell the story.
Choose a few people who have enabled you.
Gee, I guess I've had enablers all throughout life. I remember a specific conversation I had with a gentleman called Doug Carnegie in the late 60s. He was one of my close friends' grandfather, and he said, "What do you want to do?" And as a 6 or 7 or 8 year old, I said I wanted to make films, and he was very encouraging of that. And he said, whether or not you make films, you know, as soon as you leave school or at some other stage, that doesn't matter, but I've always thought it's really important to do 3 different things in your life. And he came from the music industry and then became a top pole Hereford breeder, and then he wanted to win a Melbourne Cup. But it was interesting that that had a huge impact on me at an early age. And I think that was one of those conversations when I was shifting from the business world to sort of full-time arts and philanthropy that I remembered back in the recesses of my mind.
Paul Moulds from the Oasis project, what impacts he had on you?
He's had an enormous impact, and I think when you see someone who's working 7 days a week and just so tirelessly for something he believes in, it's very difficult to not try and help. And I think it wasn't until I was in my mid-30s that I really started to get a much greater sense of awareness of the problems in the community. So it's probably pretty late. I'm hoping this next generation is far more aware than I was. But I think when you meet someone like Paul Moulds and Robin Moulds and so many people in the space, you realise what dedication is. And literally from the time I met Paul, I sort of wanted to help. I didn't know how I could help. But one Christmas day I met him and he said, "Oh, why don't you come along and we'll show you what we're doing at the shelter," and that was sort of in the mid to late 90s, and we've stayed very close friends ever since.
I've always thought the documentary films are made by people that can't help themselves. There's no rational reason to make a documentary. What are you working on now?
Working on a number of films, but the one which is spending the most time on is on the singer-songwriter Paul Kelly. And that's an intriguing story, and I think we've potentially got an education campaign around that certainly is as ambitious as the Oasis film. But whilst I'm doing that, the Oasis outreach campaign kicks on, and I think when you take on these projects, you can't sort of say, okay, the film screened on the ABC, that's it, problem solved, and there'll be no more homelessness. I guess with Oasis and any of these films we take on, we're almost taking sort of a 20-year approach to it, and we've got to stick with it for the long haul. So with Oasis, we've come out with 3 other films, and one's about to be released since Oasis, that have been about specific aspects of the story. And next year I'm going to be spending a year in a maximum security prison on the outskirts of Victoria, and that's another element that's come out of the Oasis story about what is it about these kids who have been in the prison system that just keeps them going back in, and that's another aspect. Next year we're launching a film we've just completed on a volunteer, and I think one of the things we want to try and encourage is volunteerism. It's such a, if ever there's a lesson that the impact that one person can have on so many other people's lives, again it's with Paul Moulds, and I think the answer to so many of these issues is just one-on-one, that we can't build these huge Uber departments, that we just need more and more people on the ground that are actually going to deal with people in this very sort of hands-on manner. So that's one, and then there were a couple of films we came out with last year. One was on child abuse, and that was a subset of the homeless issue that, unfortunately, we found that of the hundreds of kids we were dealing with, so many of them had come from situations where they'd been heavily abused. And
this is Polly and Me.
This is a film called Polly and Me.
Which is half an hour or thereabouts in length. How difficult does that make it to market?
Well, the ABC once they realised that it was a drama, but it was basically built around a series of characters from the Oasis, they showed it on a Compass special, and they had Geraldine Doog with a panel. So it was difficult to market, but again, they've been very supportive with all of these films, and it's a very difficult issue to talk about, that let alone make, that child abuse is so difficult to get on the agenda. And what we tried to do with this film, which is pretty disturbing, is to get in behind closed doors and just tell the account, the story of what life was like for an 8-year-old girl, and just see where her journey may have gone. And we'll be doing a sequel to that in a couple of years when the girl's 13 or 14. But that's an ongoing story, and I think that was far more difficult to get traction with than we thought, and we engaged with 12 different community partners, organisations who are doing great things in the sector, and I think we've got a lot more work that we can hopefully do together there. That we learnt a lot out of that.
Well, I think we started with the label documentary filmmaker, but I think the conversation's indicated there's so much more. So Ian, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Peter.